This GeekWire podcast is brought to you by BECU. Stay tuned to the break as Brian Westbrook interviews BECU's Stacy Black for today's money hack on how to stop living paycheck to paycheck. For more money hacks, check out geekwire.com/BECU. I've got just some basic questions. Just want to get your overall thoughts on DeepSeek and maybe find out a little bit about bigger picture stuff about AI, how you're thinking about it these days. Just a casual conversation. So Curt's going to start recording.
We're on.
Okay, and I've got it.
And by the way, I am an AI agent. I'm not real. So just so you guys know.
In a few months, I won't be able to tell the difference anyway.
I know.
Hi, and welcome to GeekWire from GeekWire.com in Seattle. I'm Todd Bishop.
And I'm John Cook.
We are coming to you from Redmond, Washington, on the Microsoft campus, where we're in the middle of the newly constructed Microsoft campus. And in fact, there's still construction happening right over there, over your shoulder, John. So we got some good ambient sound here on the pod this week.
Yeah, construction sound, really exciting. But it's cool. It's very different than the old campus, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, you were commenting as we were walking around, it's not nearly the forest that it once was when it was, buildings 1 through 9 or 1 through 7 or whatever it was in the past.
You can't smell the pine trees anymore.
No, you definitely can't. So we are over here today because you and I just took a really cool tour, which we can talk in more detail about in the future, but we got to get an inside peek at the Microsoft archives. And I think we might have been the first outside journalists, at least, to go inside the Microsoft archives. And we're doing this, of course, as part of our Microsoft at 50 series. John, I brought you along in part because you're the historian among the two of us. You studied history in college. It was a pretty cool experience.
I loved it. It was vast, wasn't it? I mean, there was a lot of material. I really enjoyed seeing the software wall, which was impressive. They have basically every copy of software Microsoft's ever created in 50 years of history. So, and they have at least three copies of it packaged. It's very impressive.
I loved the memorabilia, all the different things that we got to see. And of course, we'll be writing about this later on. I don't want to totally give the story away, but let me just say, Clippy was there.
Clippy was there. It was like any sort of gadget or item that was given away that had a Microsoft or a Microsoft product on it is in this archive, and it was impressive.
We'll talk about that more on a future show, and we'll have a story on the site as part of our Microsoft at 50 series. By the way, you can check out our Microsoft at 50 series at geekwire.com/Microsoft50. And don't forget, we do have our event coming up on March 20th at Town Hall Seattle, where we will have, among other featured speakers, former Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer joining us, plus others from the current times of Microsoft. So we're really looking forward to that event on March 20th.
Yeah, and if you're interested in tickets, just go to geekwire.com/events. And a big thanks to our partners at Accenture, which is underwriting the series, the podcast, and the event.
All right, so stay tuned for much more on that in the weeks and months ahead. Coming up later on the show, we'll be talking with an expert from the University of Washington about one of the big news stories of the week, DeepSeek, the breakthrough AI venture from China that really kind of upended the tech world this week. And so stick around for that. But John, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I wanted to ask you, how big of a deal do you think it is?
This might be one of those situations where long-term it points to an important trend in terms of open source software and the efficiency of these AI models, and yet is not nearly as huge as the world seems to think it is right now. That's my take. And we'll get into that more later on, too. What did you think?
It did seem like one of those kind of seminal moments in technology history.
Really?
It did. I mean, it had that feel to it in terms of just a shift in how people are thinking about AI. You think back to things like the Netscape IPO, and in retrospect, Netscape really didn't become this massive company. But you think of this moment in time of like, oh, that really sparked or signaled a shift to the internet era in that case, right? Is this the moment that signals the shift to the AI era? Because It really impacted Wall Street and the economy, unlike, I think, anything we've seen. And it does speak to this theory. A lot of people have been talking about the next unicorn, so company $1 billion or more valuation will be built by 10 or fewer people. And this whole trend line of seeing companies that are shrinking or can do so much more with less, I think it points to that trend line. So I don't know if DeepSeek will be that company. As to your point, probably not. But I think it does signal that we're moving into this new era, a new AI era, that companies can be built in a much more efficient and effective manner and transform industries.
And we'll, as I said, have a lot more on this coming up. But I actually wanted to talk with you in this first segment about something else entirely. And that was the court filing that we unearthed. In fact, Taylor Soper, GeekWire's editor, on vacation, emailed us because he spotted it at 2 a.m. from wherever he is in Europe in the court filings in the email that we get every day. Amazon sued Washington State this week to block the Washington Post from going forward unfettered with a public records request about Amazon's Project Kuiper space venture. And John, you summed this story up very succinctly in a way that ended up making it into our headline, and that was
Bezos versus Bezos. Now, Todd, did you get I think it was it's either 1970s or 1980s movie reference I was playing off of?
No.
Oh, you didn't get that? Because this is what was going through
Kramer versus Kramer?
Yeah, Kramer versus Kramer. That was, man, we're old. We're old. But anyway, I was like, it was a Kramer versus Kramer moment. But this was certainly Bezos with his Washington Post and Bezos with Amazon Project Kuiper going head to head, not liking what each other are doing.
So for people who missed this story, I'll link to it in the show notes. But effectively, the Washington Post, to its credit, even on stories involving its owner, their newsroom is very aggressive, as you would want them to be. And they issued a public records request to the Washington State Department of Labor and Industries for the results of a series of inspections that happened at a Project Kuiper facility not far from here in Redmond. And that was the subject of their public records request to try and get those inspection records. And Amazon went to court to say, hey, we're okay if you give them records, but we need to go through a process here to get a temporary restraining order to make sure that the state is not giving the Washington Post proprietary things, confidential details, stuff that, for example, Elon Musk might like to know, or more accurately, the people who work for Elon Musk at SpaceX might benefit from in terms of learning about Project Kuiper. That was effectively what was going on there with that filing. When you really dug into it, it wasn't nearly as dramatic, perhaps, as Bezos versus Bezos, which we explained in the story. But just the fact that you would have these two entities that are so closely associated with him fighting in court, and not directly, but opposing each other in this action, I found fascinating.
And it speaks to some of the bigger issues that I think Bezos is facing with the Washington Post in terms of having the interests of the Washington Post going up and butting heads with some of his other interests. And it makes it very challenging for him to own that newspaper.
It does. And of course, one of his interests right now is ensuring that he and Amazon are in the good graces of the current presidential administration. And that certainly is not part of the mission statement of the Washington Post. If anything, it's the opposite. It's making sure that they're scrutinizing the current presidential administration. And you really see the tension there on the journalistic side, even more so, I think, than you do on the opinion and the editorial side, the editorial page, because in that situation, you're supposed to have a take, you're supposed to have an opinion, and it's just sort of a matter of course that you would be perhaps criticizing the current administration. But when your journalists are doing their job and going after information that the administration might not want out, or that Amazon, a big company, might not want out there, I mean, they're doing their jobs, and it's not in Jeff Bezos' interests in either of those cases.
Yeah, as I said, it puts him in a challenging position, and I'm not sure how this is going to play out. You can also, you can understand Amazon's desires, and as I read your story and as I understand it, they aren't objecting necessarily to the full request for information. They just believe that there are components of what was going to be provided by Washington State that got into the area of trade secrets that they did not want disclosed. So you can understand their position on this, and I'm not sure how it's going to play out. Any prognostications on that?
Yes, in fact, we do have a literal precedent here in that the Seattle Times has been through this process before where they did a public records request for some other records related to Amazon that the state had. And that situation ended up going to court as well. And so Amazon cited that. And effectively, they end up with a way to decide what gets released and what doesn't. And the temporary restraining order would end up setting the guidelines for that. So I think it'll be a amicable outcome in the end.
And the main issue was that there were safety violations potentially going on at the Project Kuiper facility here in Redmond.
That is certainly the implication of all of this. There were no details coming out in the lawsuit that would indicate exactly what those violations were, or in fact, if there even were violations, all we know is that there have been a series of inspections and investigations into the facility about what's going on there. So lots to dig into there.
So Todd, I just wanted to ask you, you've covered Microsoft for coming up on 30 years. Here we are sitting on the campus. It's transformed so much. Any just kind of big picture takeaways as you sit here in the middle of this remodeled, renewed campus?
Yeah, so where we are is the site of the original Redmond buildings. This was effectively the X-Wing buildings, or the ones that from above looked like the Star Wars. And this is where Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer and all of the early Microsoft employees were based when the heart of this company was created, starting in the 1980s into the 1990s. And to see this campus really transformed, and you can literally hear the next generation, the new era of Microsoft being built behind us here. To me, it's kind of cool. It's a symbolic place. It's the place the company was not born, but certainly grew up. And you can see its future taking shape right here in a lot of ways. One of the questions I've been asking people as part of our Microsoft at 50 reporting is, what are the next 50 years going to be like? The cool thing here is, I don't know what it's going to be like exactly, but these buildings around us are the place that it's going to happen, unless they go fully remote.
Well, they're putting a lot of money into this area, so I don't think they're going fully remote anytime soon. The thing that strikes me is just the scale.
Yeah.
The scale of Microsoft. When you start to drive around Redmond, when you look at this campus, and when you look at the components of the real estate, it's like a small country. I mean, really, in terms of the operations, what they have their tentacles in, it's just, you really don't get a sense of it until you see the different buildings, the different components that they have going on here. And I know we're only seeing just a small percentage of it, but it is a very large company.
It is. All right. Coming up next, we're going to have a deep dive on DeepSeek. Stick around. This GeekWire podcast is brought to you by BECU. Stay tuned as Brian Westbrook interviews BECU's Stacy Black for today's Money Hack on how to stop living paycheck to paycheck. And for more money hacks, check out geekwire.com/BECU.
Are you living paycheck to paycheck? Help is on the way. Lead financial educator for BECU, Stacy Black, is here with me. You have some tips. What should people know?
Number one, avoid quick fixes like payday loans or pawn shops. They seem like they're going to do the trick, but it just puts us in a deeper hole. And I would say look big picture, long term. Think about what resources are out there and available to you, and check with your financial institution. I know BECU has a lot of great resources for our members.
What if you are feeling like you're alone? What would you say?
You are not alone. 62% of us are living paycheck to paycheck. And so it's pretty prevalent. Just know that you're not alone and there is help available.
More advice and tips and tricks from Stacy Black, lead financial educator for BECU, is available on Money Hacks at geekwire.com/BECU.
Listen to the full interview and find more episodes of Money Hacks at geekwire.com/BECU and find more information at becu.org. This week, there was a big word in the news. All throughout the week in the tech world, it was about DeepSeek. And we're going to be diving into this new artificial intelligence project and technology and what it means for the industry and the broader world this week on the show with our guest, Bill Howe. He is an associate professor at the University of Washington's Information School. He's also an adjunct associate professor of computer science and engineering and electrical engineering, and the co-founding director of the Center for Responsible AI Systems and Experiences. Bill, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
So I was checking Twitter X over the weekend, and suddenly I just randomly started to see all of this stuff tangentially referring to this big news story that I was clearly missing in the moment. And finally, I saw the name DeepSeek. I have a general understanding just from covering some of this week, and people may have read some of the stories, but can you give us a sense for your perspective on, first, what DeepSeek is and really why it matters in the scheme of the world of artificial intelligence?
Well, maybe I'll talk about that in reverse order there. The why it matters is really for two reasons. One is that a model that is not from one of the usual suspects is putting up numbers that is competitive with some of the biggest models in the world that have been capturing people's attention here for a couple of years and been capturing most of the market and so on. So that alone is impressive and worthy of some attention. Even more important than that, though, is that it's open. So you can download a version of this and run it locally and experiment with it and extend it. And people have already begun to do so just in the past week. So that is a continuation of a strategy that is proffered by Meta and companies like Hugging Face and research work here at the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence connected with UW and other universities. But to see that open strategy is having that much of an impact by being able to compete with some of the largest models in the world is exciting. And so what it is, so it is an AI model that can be deployed as a chatbot, like we're all probably familiar with at this point, where you can interact with it the same way as you can with ChatGPT, for example, and other models from other big tech companies. The deployment that is in some of the ways it's being talked about in the press is directly comparable to what's going on with ChatGPT. You log into somebody else's server and you interact with the thing and you do that kind of work. That's fine. And that's impactful. And apparently I think I heard that, the app for mobile devices is, hitting records of some kind of number of downloads and so on. So that all makes sense. And that's all fine. But there you're interacting with a deployment of the technology that's remote. The other impact is that, again, you can download and run it yourself. And so that's where, researchers and practitioners and companies who already have some facility with training their own models or by modifying their own models are excited about the possibility of having access to the reasoning capabilities in particular that were previously thought of as only among the largest models, and in particular GPT-01 and soon to be released 03. And so I think, the fact that you can compete with those is what sent stocks reacting and sent strategists reacting and sent futurists kind of reacting and sent researchers reacting for that. And then there are some reasons why the technique they use is actually pretty impressive as well, because it's relatively simple and it seems to work.
My understanding is that they were effectively able to skip some steps in the post-training process.
That's right.
And so they take an existing model and they fine-tune it, they refine it. That's the usual post-training process. But in this case, they basically said, okay, we're not going to be doing supervised fine-tuning to the extent that many others are. And these are all sort of terms of art in the practice of training AI models. And maybe you can get into some of the details, because all of this it's about reinforcement learning. But the gist, as I understand it, is if that kind of performance is possible in a model that competes with some of the giants, suddenly perhaps all of these AI chips, all of these AI data centers aren't going to be needed to the extent that was previously thought.
So that latter point, so how it works, just to repeat some of the terminology that you used. Yeah, these things, there is a pre-training component that is very expensive and requires, sort of to a first approximation, downloading every word ever written on the internet and teaching these things about language. But if you just try to release a model that has only gone through that phase, like they did in the early days of some of these models being released, it's not very good, right? It doesn't seem to sort of hold a conversation. It says kind of weird, wild things, and it's not very effective for any particular task. And so, as you mentioned, the post-training phase is really where you kind of zero in on making this thing useful for particular tasks. And typically, post-training is a little bit more broader of a term, and the work they did in DeepSeek is an example of post-training. But the typical pattern for post-training was two more phases: one for instruction tuning, to teach it how to kind of follow instructions and kind of be a helpful assistant and respond to what humans are asking for. And without that, it kind of would if you remember early on, it was professing love for interviewers and so forth. It would get kind of wild. So that was what kind of hammers it in. And then another phase of reinforcement learning with human feedback, and this is where we kind of vote on, express preferences on, this response is better than this response, and so on. And this is where you kind of get some of the language refined so that it's useful, but it also is where people kind of complain that it maybe gets over censored and over sanitized, and sometimes hard to let it be creative. And so there's a bit of a trade-off there. And so, as you pointed out, the both of those latter two steps are replaced with a reinforcement learning on the base model itself. There's still a data requirement. There's still some work to do. It's still expensive, but by using reinforcement learning at that phase, there's less prescriptive control over exactly how it learns and what it learns. And so that there was perhaps generally a belief that wasn't going to work very well at that phase. And this project has sort of shown that it can work really well, that it will come up with its own strategies for how to solve these reasoning tasks. For example, it will think down one path and then realize that maybe it made a mistake and back up and sort of go down another path. And you'll see this all come out in the tokens that are representing its thinking, its internal process. I'm very sensitive about anthropomorphizing these things a little bit too much. So if I use words like thinking, I don't actually believe that they're thinking, but it's just more of a shorthand for describing the effect. But you see some of these strategies for how to reason about these hard problems that people believed required significantly different tricks to be able to achieve that. And the fact that a relatively simple, relatively straightforward application of reinforcement learning on essentially what they reward for is basically correctness on some tasks, as well as kind of a style of output for interpretability, and that's it. That's a relatively simple ask. It's something many researchers could do, or many practitioners could do, that it can learn on its own that degree of reasoning, competitive with O1 on sort of PhD level math problems and so on. That's impressive, right? That opens up different strategies here. The last point you made, I won't purport to be a expert in market dynamics here, but I'm personally not of the mind that this has much long-term effect on the pressure, supply chain pressure on GPUs, and for a couple of reasons. One is, just because you get more efficient use out of a GPU doesn't really mean you need less of them, right? You sort of do more with them with what you have, and we saw this with cloud computing over the time. You would rent some CPUs and they would get more efficient at what your tasks were, but then you would just do more with what you had available, as opposed to actually sort of fixing that. But the other reason is that these techniques can be combined with other techniques, right? So even though OpenAI was really pushing scale, and that was essentially their entire strategy, that was never really believed to be the only thing you could do to get higher performance. But it also doesn't mean that it doesn't give higher performance. So this approach, combined with scale, combined with other techniques, combined with other techniques for inference time compute, which is using more GPUs at the time of the query coming in, as opposed to during training time. All of these things can be combined in different ways to try to achieve specialized behavior in particular areas, or better overall performance in some particular benchmark, or any other thing. So I think the race is still on in terms of figuring out how best to use these for applications without causing too much problems for society or for your bottom line. And I don't personally see that as translating into reduced lower prices for NVIDIA.
Right. All right. This was also a big deal for Microsoft this past week. It came up on the company's earnings call, and I want to dive into the implications for Microsoft when we come back. You're listening to GeekWire. We're talking about DeepSeek AI this week, and we'll be right back. It's Todd Bishop, and I wanted to tell you about a favorite podcast of mine. It's called Booming, and it's a show that has opened my eyes to a whole range of things, like what's really happening when I scan a digital coupon at the grocery store, and how robots are changing the construction of buildings in downtown Seattle, among many other topics. Booming is a podcast from KUOW Public Radio in Seattle. It's about the economic forces shaping our lives in the Pacific Northwest. It's co-hosted by reporters Joshua McNichols and Monica Nicholsberg. That's a familiar name and voice to longtime GeekWire readers and listeners. They answer questions that listeners are wondering about, like why are sports tickets so expensive? Or how hard should you actually work at work? Plus, every episode ends with a game. That's Booming from KUOW Public Radio. Find episodes on the KUOW app or wherever you get your podcasts. Welcome back. It's Todd Bishop. My guest this week is Bill Howe. He's an associate professor at the Information School at the University of Washington in Seattle and co-founding director of the Center for Responsible AI Systems and Experiences. So, Bill, you mentioned earlier that long-term demand for hardware for GPUs, something like DeepSeek, even if it is more efficient, doesn't necessarily signal that people are going to need fewer GPUs in the world than they might have otherwise. And this came up in Microsoft's earnings as well, because here you have Microsoft, which just recently acknowledged that they're going to be spending $80 billion this fiscal year on their data center build out, on their new processors to support what they see as long-term AI demand. And it was a really interesting dance that Satya Nadella made on the earnings call, because effectively the way I heard it was that Microsoft will need that capacity to serve either the training or the inference. In other words, it'll either come in the process of creating the AI models, the training, or in the process of using the AI models, its customers using the AI models. And his point was, hey, if things get more efficient, you're going to see greater usage. We're going to need that capacity regardless. So don't penalize us for setting down this kind of irreversible course of spending tens and tens of billions of dollars on capital improvements and expenses that we otherwise wouldn't have. Am I interpreting that correctly?
I didn't listen to the call, but I would tend to agree with the analysis that, we have analogs of this in the past, right? When you would build a big, expensive on-prem, big data cluster 10, 15 years ago or something, it might sit idle there a little bit in the beginning, but then people start to make up new uses for it, right? They would say, maybe I should try this on the cluster. And so eventually you kind of end up saturating whatever it is you have available. And so, and then with AI, you've got several different dimensions of growth to go here. First of all, it immediately reaches down into the layperson applications in a way that really no technology ever has, besides maybe the internet or maybe browsers or something. But it's, anybody can use these things. And so the applications there are only just beginning to be explored. And then, on say in science and research, right? These are only beginning to be explored. So there's all kinds of use cases that are coming out just along the application dimension. But then, as I mentioned, you might want to have 25 different variations of models being trained and executed and run and experimented with in order to see what's best. That's another area of growth, is maybe we try 100 different variations of these things if we have the hardware available. So I think that's a reasonable strategy. Not everybody, of course, can apply it the way Microsoft can, but I think that's a desire for everyone, is that having more access to GPUs does tend to help. I'm not a big fan of that happening, right? It does having it be sort of the rich get richer, and it's all about hoarding GPUs, and NVIDIA, stock goes through the roof and so forth, is not an ideal situation for kind of, say, university research where, we could get by with a handful of these. And so the good news there, though, I think, is techniques, perhaps like DeepSeek's version of post-training. And, the most important thing here is the commitment to open that delivers all the goods. But the fact that you can sort of potentially get, we personally in our lab believe for a while that, hey, look, I'm not really sure that there's any fundamental difference between what can be done with a large model and what can be done with a small model. There are some scaling laws that people articulate, but there's also some evidence and some signals that they're not quite as rock solid as the people who are interested in scale would have you believe. And so we were optimistic about the ability for small models to really achieve good results. And so things like this coming out where we can go try to apply it in some of the applications that we work on is a real boon. It's fantastic. So yes to pressure on GPUs, and I would tend to agree that Microsoft probably should have followed that strategy. But also good news for smaller labs and smaller companies and smaller units that can't necessarily afford to buy into a bank of 100,000 GPUs.
You mentioned the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence earlier, AI2 as they're known. They're based here in Seattle. This was the research lab started by the late Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen more than a decade ago. And there's a lot of crossover with the University of Washington. Many of their senior researchers are also University of Washington professors, especially in the Allen School. But it was interesting. They just released a new version of their Tulu 3 model with 405 billion parameters, which is, just for context, up from about 70 billion in their prior release in terms of the overall size and complexity of the model. But they too have been very focused on finding efficiencies in post-training, really bringing down the overall requirements for AI processing needed in this training process. And I've got a couple of thoughts here. One is, they announced a lot of the Tulu breakthroughs last fall. We covered them on GeekWire. And as soon as I saw the DeepSeek stuff, I was like, I know I've read something about that before. And there's a little bit of a Silicon Valley echo chamber that tends to happen with this stuff. And perhaps it's also the intrigue of something coming out of China. I wondered why the AI2 announcement last fall didn't create quite the same amount of buzz or impact in the market.
Yeah, I don't know for sure. I think I would argue that, certainly among those who are not really close to the research, the source of the model coming from China is a big deal. The fact that there was a reaction, once there's a bit of a snowball effect, I guess once there's a bit of a reaction out of big tech, it starts to become a even bigger reaction. So I think there might be some lucky runaway feedback loops or something but I don't really know for sure. I think on the actual capabilities, though, the fact that they were leading with the evidence that they could compete with the newer reasoning models. And while Tulu does have some evidence along those same lines and certainly has explored some of the similar techniques, it was more of a package of here's a research capability that we can now give you through everything open, which of course is much more difficult and much more impressive and much more exciting overall and will have more of a longer term impact. But the fact that they were kind of having a very narrow message of, we can reason as well as the best reasoning models in the world, and here's how, and we did it on the cheap. Although on the cheap requires a little bit of scrutiny as well. They still use pre-trained models that were really, really big and required a lot of computing. So it's not some of the numbers quoted in the paper are not. You got to properly interpret them to see that. However, there is an argument that you too can now have on your computer something that is relatively competitive with some of the best models in the world that were hidden behind $200 a month fees, and that's impressive. So I think it might just be more of a broad message for targeting the research community versus a narrow message targeting kind of specifically OpenAI that might account for some of that. But it's a reasonable question. So
just to make sure I'm understanding correctly, AI2 was a broad message targeting the larger research community, whereas comparing DeepSeek to OpenAI, that message is going to penetrate more into the tech zeitgeist.
That would be my guess. In addition to, like you said, the source of being in China. I mean, again, Tulu 3 has a variety of post training techniques that are all open with the data sets carefully open as well. I mean, again, we should be careful with the word open too, right? There's sort of open source, which is not quite as relevant with some of these models because we usually know how the actual code is written. There's open methods. Do they actually describe precisely what they did, or did they describe at a high level what they did where it's hard to replicate? And then, of course, the big ones are open data or not, right? Do you actually say what your pre-training data set was, what your post-training data sets was? And DeepSeek does better than many on this, but very few models are truly open. The work at AI2 is working hard to meet the bar of being sort of fully open at every level. And so that is, extremely difficult work, extremely expensive work, and is an absolute benefit to the entire community. That was their mission, I think, was to have that complete openness, which is not quite the same thing as, show off your leaderboard competitiveness with one particular model.
It's funny, though. I've seen in the AI2 releases, they've learned a little bit of the trick. So they've started coming out with playgrounds, they call them, where they're basically demonstrating the chatbot capabilities of each of the models they come out with. And they've also started releasing very specific benchmarks. In fact, they said that the Tulu 3 model 405B is essentially rivaling and in some cases exceeding GPT-4o and DeepSeek v3. That was the announcement. And I'll link from the show notes to the article that we wrote about the latest release of Tulu 3 just this week, so folks can see those benchmarks. But they seem to be learning the game a bit.
I think that's right, but I would point out that 4.0 is not the reasoning. It does not tend to have those advanced reasoning capabilities that have been very, very recently. It's only been the last couple of months that these have kind of taken off. But with this notion of compute time inference that you alluded to earlier, let it think longer tends to get you a better result. That wasn't the case with the early models. You went in one pass and you get it spit out whatever it spit out, and it was you often surprisingly correct, which is what kind of got everybody's attention on this. But this idea of like keep going longer, keep thinking more and more and more until and watch the answer get better and better. That's what O1 from OpenAI had purported to do, and you could see the results. I mean, it really people's anecdotal experience, including my own, was like, wow, this really is better. It can do some pretty impressive things. And so DeepSeek has some of that ability to achieve those similar results, and yet I can download a version of it. If I get a small distilled version of it, then it's not quite as good. That's understandable. That's reasonable, but it's close. And I think people, we'll still see how some of the experiments shake out, because there's lots of people working on these things as we speak. But the overall experience is that, this may be competitive with the bigger models. So I think while some of the techniques in Tulu can certainly achieve those results, I don't know if that's been their focus in some of their benchmarks.
Very interesting. That's really good clarification. Thank you. Another key question in all of this was the origins of DeepSeek. I think part of the appeal or the allure of this release was the fact that it is from China and it's something that can compete with the big proprietary models in an open source way. But I'm curious, given all the separate discussion in a whole other realm about TikTok, should people in the US be concerned at all about the origins of this particular AI technology?
Yes and no, depending on what context you're interfacing with this thing. My opinion, without having been there when they deployed it, when you access their deployed version on their server, like you would say ChatGPT, except you're going to DeepSeek or through the app, you are engaging with the censorship apparatus of China, right? And so you can actually see this if you ask for some more information about Tiananmen Square, you'll see what happens. And so that's not great, and we don't know the extent of what they are going to be flagging and controlling and so forth. However, the model itself, when you download it locally, it's a little less clear that there's any sort of influence of that type. It's technically, it might be possible to control that sort of thing if they had done some secret level of fine tuning that controls for certain things, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence of that right now. So my belief as of, we're a week in here, is that if you're downloading the model, you tend to be getting something that's comparable to other open models that you can get as well, that just may be varying capabilities, but aren't sort of sending information back to the mothership, nor are they censoring things, nor are they, none of the other things you might imagine. But if you're accessing it on the other servers, I think, your mileage may vary, and you probably would have a hard time arguing why you should be surprised if you do find out that they're harvesting information from you. And the same could be said for hosted models here in the United States as well in various ways, right? I mean, there's different assertions they've made about what people are and are not tracking, but it's a little bit difficult to verify some of that.
Yeah, so user beware, I guess. Yeah.
Which is another vote for the open models. If we can run them ourselves, if some company or some research lab or something can run it themselves, we can have more reproducibility. We can understand what we're doing. We can make sure that we're not tracking anything or storing anything. And that's an important component to this.
And notably, both Microsoft and Amazon this week very quickly said, okay, we're going to make DeepSeek available through their managed services, their cloud services. I mean, it's funny, it was so fast, and the stuff gets so trendy so quick. It's amazing. So, Bill, it sounds like this is in many ways a mixed blessing for the industry, for users, but overall, I'm taking from you that if this is a proof point for the value of open source in AI, then ultimately that's better for users, for businesses, and just tends to open things up long term.
I think so. I think the only argument that I can think of against it, besides protecting someone's bottom line in aggressive ways, as we've seen some of these companies do, but if you're not worried about them, the only other argument I can imagine is that it does proliferate, pretty capable technology into a lot of people's hands, and there's been, as there's been a lot of concern about that over the last several years. So I don't personally tend to subscribe to most of those scenarios that people lay out. But if one does subscribe to those scenarios, then, sure, perhaps open does make it harder to contain or control. So I think that similarly within the security world, that open is the only thing we have to really design collectively protections against the possible harms, and that when people try to keep it proprietary, it ends up being actually more dangerous than less. However, reasonable people can disagree on some of those points.
Any final thoughts on where we're headed from here? If you think of this as sort of a new starting point, maybe that's overstating it based on what you said earlier, but what should we be looking out for? And if this reflects a trend, where might that trend go in the next few months or the rest of the year?
Well, in the recent past, I think the trend was what I'll say in a second, and this only catalyzes it really. So I think the trend that we were seeing was moving from direct interaction with these things for question and answering, or for generate me a report, or for reformatting some data, or these kind of handy things that kind of augment things, but move more into agents that can take multiple actions in sequence and actually interact with the world. So go out to some web page and book me a trip, or interact with this person through my email account, or all this work we've seen on agents that I'm sure you covered in this podcast as well. So I think being able to democratize access to a model of varying sizes, there's sort of small ones and medium ones and big ones, and you can sort of pick and choose your ones that all have some advanced reasoning capability. That will accelerate the move into kind of an agentic era where we have agents kind of working on our behalf, scurrying around. There's a lot of downsides to that potentially, but there's also potentially a lot of upsides. But I think you'll see this year that sort of come to fruition, as opposed to being kind of promises that when you go when you actually go try some of the technology on your own, it doesn't quite work as well as the demonstration has. I think you'll start to see this really kind of be proven to be effective. One issue with that, I suppose, is the workforce question will need to be addressed pretty soon, pretty fast, especially with what's going on in this ridiculous administration.
All right. I love you saved the political angle for the very end. Bill, thank you very much. That was great. I appreciate just sort of the sense for the landscape of things. It's funny, I was talking with somebody at Microsoft this week, and they were saying it felt like 2024 packed in several years of developments into 12 months. And they felt like the past week sort of packed a full year of developments into about 5 days. And so
it's hard to keep up for people that are in the space, and it's probably even harder for people that are outside the space. So it's definitely a challenge.
Bill Howe is associate professor at the University of Washington's Information School. He's also a co-founding director of the Center for Responsible AI Systems and Experiences. Bill, thanks very much for talking with us.
Thank you so much. Anytime.
Thanks for listening. Curt Milton edited and produced this episode. Our theme music is by Daniel L.K. Caldwell. Listen early next week for a special episode of the GeekWire Podcast featuring our conversation with Bill Gates about his new book. That's coming up next week on the GeekWire Podcast. Until then, I'm Todd Bishop. Thanks for listening. What's rule number 1 of parking in a large parking garage?
Mark your spot.
Take a picture.
Yes.
What did we not do?
Well, we are lost in the Microsoft. What is this, Todd? You described this to me
This
before.
is the new Microsoft, relatively new Microsoft parking garage. I've actually gotten lost in this parking garage before, so I can't believe that it happened again. But we're going to get our steps in today because we've lost our car in the largest parking garage in the Northern Hemisphere.
Well, we talked about the scale of this campus.
Do you think it's up?
We already went up. Okay.
Let's try this.
How many steps did we do to get up?
Oh, man.
I think we're down one.
Oh. Ah, there it is! Yay!
You were right. You were on the right level.
Oh.
Well, this is a big campus with a lot of, and the parking garage is hard to navigate.
Lesson learned. We were in the orange zone.
We were on the border. Look, we were on the border of blue and orange.
Oh my goodness. All right, signing off from the Redmond parking garage.